What if I told you that by this time next year, you could have an entirely different personality,
Right.
like a different sense of humor, a different way of expressing anger, or even just a completely new internal monologue?
It sounds wild, but it's true.
Yeah, it really is. Today, we are looking at a text that argues learning a new language isn't just about acquiring a technical skill or, memorizing a dictionary.
Exactly.
It is about fundamentally rewiring your identity. So welcome to today's deep dive. If you are sitting on a train, commuting to work, prepping for a global strategy meeting, or just deeply curious about the hidden mechanics of the human brain, you are in the right place.
You definitely are.
Because the struggle to conquer a new language, to cross that terrifying chasm between feeling competent in your mother tongue and sounding like a toddler in a new one, is a universal psychological gauntlet.
It really is. And that imposter syndrome is profound, especially for adult learners. You might be a senior executive, a brilliant engineer, or just a highly articulate person in your native language.
Right.
But when you step into the arena of a new language, you are stripped of all your intellectual armor. You are suddenly fumbling for basic nouns.
And it's so frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. The resulting frustration causes millions of people to abandon the process entirely. They just assume their brains are simply no longer plastic enough to absorb new syntactic structures.
Which brings us to the source material we are unpacking today. We have our hands on a fascinating text called The 500-Sentence Guide to English Fluency.
It's a great one.
And what makes this document so compelling is that it completely abandons the dry, academic textbook approach.
Right, no boring charts.
Yeah, exactly. There are no conjugation tables in the opening chapters. Instead, the entire methodology is embedded in a 500-sentence dialogue between two characters, a learner named Omar and a guide named Layla.
I love that setup.
Me too. The text uses their conversation to map out highly practical cognitive and psychological strategies for achieving fluency.
Presenting the material as a dialogue is just a brilliant structural choice. It forces the reader to immediately engage with the target behavior, which is natural conversation, rather than treating language as like a mathematical equation to be solved.
Right.
And very early in the text, Layla establishes a foundational philosophy that challenges our modern obsession with biohacking and overnight success.
Oh, speed thing.
Exactly. Omar expresses a desire to learn English fast, and Layla completely shuts down that expectation. She frames language acquisition not as a race to a finish line, but as an ongoing biological journey.
Okay, let's unpack this because I found her pushback on the speed obsession incredibly refreshing.
Yeah, it's very necessary.
Because a race implies you're looking for shortcuts to bypass the difficult terrain. But a journey implies you actually have to walk the terrain to build the stamina.
Exactly.
And Omar, to his credit, accepts this and points out that every journey has to start somewhere. The text argues that the starting point is not the mouth, and it is certainly not the grammar book. The starting line is actually the ears.
Yes, the ears are the primary gateway for language acquisition. The source text is uncompromising on this principle. Listening is the absolute foundation upon which all other linguistic skills are built.
Right.
Layla instructs Omar to subject himself to spoken English every single day, utilizing podcasts, audiobooks, or even children's stories.
But here's where the text requires a massive leap of faith from the learner. Because Lila insists that you have to listen, even if you do not understand the words.
Which is hard for adults.
So hard. Now, as a learner, this feels entirely counterintuitive. If I tune into a podcast in a foreign language and I don't know the vocabulary, isn't it just noise?
That's the common fare, yeah.
It's like I am essentially sitting in an auditorium listening to a complex symphony, but I don't know what a violin is and I don't know what a cello is. It just hits my brain as a wall of chaotic noise. If there is no comprehension, where is the cognitive benefit?
What's fascinating here is that the benefit lies beneath the threshold of conscious comprehension in a process cognitive scientists call statistical learning.
Statistical learning.
Yeah. Lila uses the analogy of a baby to explain this to Omar. A newborn infant spends months and months submerged in the noise of their parents' language before they ever attempt to articulate a coherent word.
Right, they just listen.
Exactly. They are not looking up definitions. What their brain is doing and what your adult brain does when you listen to a foreign language without understanding is mapping the specific phonetic frequencies and rhythm of that language.
So it's less about extracting meaning and more about, like, building the auditory infrastructure.
Yes, precisely.
You have to tune the brain's acoustic receptors to a new musical scale before you can play the song.
That's a great way to put it. The human auditory cortex is a pattern recognition machine. Every language possesses its own unique cadence, its own allowable sound combinations, and its own prosody, which is the rising and falling pitch of a sentence.
Okay, I see.
When you expose yourself to the wall of sound, your brain is unconsciously analyzing where words begin and end. It is learning to distinguish between subtle vowel sounds that might not even exist in your native tongue. And without this phonetic blueprint installed in the brain, any attempt to speak or read will be built on a faulty foundation.
That completely reframes the noise into highly productive data gathering. But speaking of productivity, Omar brings up a very tempting classic shortcut in the text.
Oh, the sleep thing.
Yeah. He asked Lila about the concept of learning while sleeping. He essentially wants to know if he can pipe vocabulary through his headphones at 2 a.m. and wake up speaking like Shakespeare.
We all want that.
It is the ultimate modern fantasy, right? Zero conscious effort, maximum neurological reward.
It is an incredibly persistent myth, mostly fueled by a misunderstanding of how memory works. But Lila quickly grounds Omar in the neurological reality you cannot acquire new, complex semantic information while you are unconscious.
Bummer.
Yeah, sorry. The sleeping brain is not a sponge absorbing external audio streams.
So, no Shakespearean awakenings for Omar, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But the text doesn't dismiss sleep entirely, does it? It actually elevates it to the most important phase of the learning cycle. It just redefines what is actually happening during that time.
Exactly. Sleep is the biological mechanism for memory consolidation. Lila advises Omar to review a small, manageable number of sentences, specifically 10, right before he goes to bed.
Just 10.
Just 10. The mechanism at play here is the dialogue between the hippocampus, which stores short-term daily experiences, and the neocortex, where long-term memories reside.
Yeah.
During deep, slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus replays the day's critical information, transferring those 10 sentences into the permanent storage of the neocortex.
I love visualizing this. It is like leaving a stack of chaotic paperwork on a desk at the end of the day.
That's a good analogy.
You don't try to force more paperwork onto the desk while the office is closed. Instead, studying right before bed is like leaving a highly organized, prioritized folder for the night shift cleaning crew.
Yes.
While you sleep, that cognitive crew files the vocabulary away perfectly. If you hand the brain the right material right before the transition into sleep, you're basically weaponizing your biology.
And you are ensuring that the neural pathways you started forging during your conscious study session are insulated and strengthened overnight.
Right.
This establishes the baseline routine, absorbing the auditory frequencies during the day and feeding targeted material to the hippocampus right before bed. But eventually, the learner has to cross the most terrifying threshold in language acquisition.
Speaking.
Exactly. They have to open their mouth and produce the sounds themselves.
Moving from passive input to active output.
Yeah.
So the text introduces a mechanical exercise for this transition called shadowing.
Yes, shadowing.
Omar asks how he can practice speaking when he doesn't have a conversation partner available. Lila explains that shadowing involves listening to a native speaker and repeating what they say immediately. overlapping their speech by just a fraction of a second. You basically trail their voice like a shadow.
It is a phenomenal technique because it bypasses the analytical mind.
How so?
Well, when you shadow, you don't have time to think about grammar or translation. You are entirely focused on mimicking the pitch, the rhythm, and the exact articulation of the speaker.
Right.
You are forcing your articulatory system, your jaw, your tongue, lips, and vocal cords to mimic the physical movements of a native speaker in real time.
Omar actually admits in the dialogue that he used to practice speaking by talking to himself in the mirror.
A classic move.
Yeah. And he acknowledges how deeply silly and awkward it feels. We all know that feeling of staring at our own reflection, exaggerating our mouth movements, and feeling incredibly foolish.
Oh, yeah.
But Lila validates this immediately. She frames language not as an intellectual puzzle, but as a physical, biological act.
The term she uses, which is critical here, is muscle memory. We easily accept that learning to play the piano or swing a tennis racket requires repetitive physical conditioning.
Right.
Language is no different. The motor cortex in your brain has to learn how to coordinate dozens of tiny muscles in your throat and mouth to produce completely foreign phonetic shapes at lightning speed.
Wow. Yeah.
When Omar talks to himself in the mirror, he is physically rehabilitating his vocal tract to accommodate the new language.
You are quite literally working out the muscles of your face.
Exactly.
But there is a massive psychological roadblock that stops people from engaging in this physical practice, which the text tackles head-on: the paralyzing fear of making mistakes. Adult learners especially are terrified of sounding incompetent.
Because in our professional and personal lives, competence is our currency. Mistakes are usually penalized.
Right.
The text explicitly demands a reversal of this mindset. Lila tells Omar that making mistakes is not a sign of failure. It is the fundamental proof of progress.
And Omar agrees, stating that if you aren't making mistakes, you simply aren't trying hard enough.
Yeah.
A mistake is essentially your brain testing a hypothesis in real time. You construct a sentence based on your current understanding of the rules, you push it out into the world, and if the listener looks confused or you realize it sounds clunky, your brain receives immediate feedback to update the model. The error correction cycle is the engine of fluency.
And without that friction, there is no neuroplastic adaptation. To accelerate that error correction cycle, Lila recommends a practice that most people find viscerally repulsive.
Oh, the recording.
Yes, recording yourself speaking on your smartphone and listening back to analyze your errors.
Reading that piece of advice caused a physical cringe.
Yeah.
Omar reacts exactly the same way. He tells Lila, "I hate hearing my own voice, to be honest."
Everyone does.
It is a completely universal discomfort. Why does the human brain recoil so violently when confronted with an audio recording of its own voice?
It creates profound cognitive dissonance. When you speak naturally, you hear your voice through two channels simultaneously.
Okay.
There's air conduction sound waves hitting your eardrums from the outside, and bone conduction vibrations traveling directly through the bones of your skull to your inner ear.
Right.
Bone conduction amplifies lower frequencies, which is why your voice always sounds richer, deeper, and more resonant inside your own head.
That makes sense.
When you listen to a recording, you hear only the air-conducted sound. It sounds thinner, higher, and objectively foreign. Your brain rejects it because it contradicts your internalized sense of identity.
You are confronting the reality of how the rest of the world perceives you, which is inherently vulnerable.
Absolutely.
But Lila insists that overcoming this cringe factor is non-negotiable. It is the ultimate diagnostic tool.
It really is.
Because when you are engaged in a live conversation, your cognitive RAM is maxed out just trying to retrieve the next vocabulary word and parse the grammar. You do not have the bandwidth to simultaneously monitor your pronunciation.
Right.
When you listen to a recording after the fact, you free up all that cognitive energy to objectively hear where your rhythm stumbled or your vowels flattened out, you become your own linguistic auditor.
And that auditing process naturally brings up another major source of anxiety for Omar, the fear of having a noticeable accent.
Oh, this is a big one.
Huge. Layla's response here is a masterclass in psychological reframing. She advises him to completely abandon the goal of sounding exactly like a native speaker and instead aim for intelligibility.
Intelligibility.
Yes. The primary function of language is to transfer an idea from your brain into someone else's brain. If the idea arrives intact, the communication is successful.
She points out that everyone possesses an accent, including native speakers across different regions. But the paradigm shift happens when she tells Omar that a foreign accent is not a defect, it is a badge of honor.
I love that.
It is the physical, auditory proof that you possess the intelligence and the grit to navigate the world in more than one language. It broadcasts to the listener that you have stepped completely outside of your comfort zone to connect with them.
Removing the shame associated with an accent liberates the learner to speak more frequently, which, ironically, is the only way to eventually smooth out the pronunciation. But isolated practice recording yourself, shadowing, speaking in the mirror, will only take you so far. The text argues that to trigger deep neurological adaptation, you must radically alter your daily environment.
Which usually triggers the classic excuse, I can't learn English because I can't afford to move to London or New York.
Right.
But Layla dismantles this geographical myth completely. She introduces the concept of the immersion bubble. You don't need to change your zip code. You just need to hijack your immediate surroundings.
The bubble.
She gives Omar highly specific, granular instructions. Switch the operating system on your phone to English. Stick visual labels on everyday objects, a sticky note on the refrigerator that says fridge, one on the door that says door. Write your mundane grocery lists in English.
What she is advocating is a hostile takeover of your daily visual and auditory inputs.
A hostile takeover, I like that.
Because if you treat a language as a subject you study at a desk for 45 minutes on a Tuesday, your brain categorizes it as abstract, low-priority information.
Yeah.
By plastering it across your kitchen and your smartphone, you signal to your brain that this language is a mandatory tool for basic survival and navigation.
You are transforming the language from a textbook exercise into the actual water you swim in. Yeah. Every time you open the refrigerator, you subconsciously process the word fridge.
Exactly.
You are accumulating hundreds of microexposures a day without expending any deliberate study effort. But within this immersion bubble, Layla identifies a massive hidden trap regarding media consumption. I call it the subtitle trap.
This is perhaps one of the most critical mechanical warnings in the entire text. When Omar asks about watching movies to improve his English, Layla lays down an absolute non-negotiable rule.
What is it?
Use English subtitles, but never use subtitles in your native language.
Right. Why is leaning on native subtitles so damaging, though? Omar notes that it feels like a lazy shortcut, but the mechanics behind why it fails are fascinating.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if we look at the brain's processing power, the human brain is an aggressively efficient organ. It is always looking for the path of least metabolic resistance.
So it's inherently lazy.
Pretty much, yeah. Reading a subtitle in your mother tongue requires almost zero cognitive effort. Decoding a rapid, chaotic stream of foreign audio requires massive cognitive energy.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. The brain, seeking efficiency, will simply default to the visual text in your native language and completely tune out the English audio.
It just ignores it.
Yeah, it treats the spoken English as irrelevant background noise, like the hum of an air conditioner. You might think you are studying, but you are effectively just reading a book in your native language while English audio plays in the background.
Wow. By forcing the subtitles to be in English, you eliminate that shortcut. You force the auditory and visual processing centers of the brain to sync up. You hear the chaotic sound, you see the spelled word on the screen, and the brain is forced to build a bridge between the two. However, Omar points out a practical problem. When watching authentic content like sitcoms, which Lila recommends for absorbing casual slang, the actors speak with a velocity that is completely overwhelming for a beginner.
Yes, because native speakers employ connected speech. They don't pronounce words in isolation. They mash them together, drop consonants, and blend vowels.
Right, like what are you going to do?
Exactly. It becomes what chaganado.
Lila offers a brilliantly simple technological hack for this: slow the video playback speed down to 0.75.
It's so simple but so effective.
It seems almost too simple, right?
Sure.
But it is a game changer. It instantly makes hyper-authentic, full-speed cultural content accessible to a beginner without distorting the natural pitch or intonation too severely. It stretches the audio just enough to let the brain identify the boundaries between the blended words.
It gives your auditory cortex the crucial milliseconds it needs to parse the phones. Once the brain learns the pattern at 0.75 speed, it can eventually recognize it at full speed.
Which is brilliant.
But beyond hacking your phone settings and your television, the text reveals an even deeper layer of immersion. It is the ultimate fluency hack, and it takes place entirely inside the learner's own mind.
Thinking in English.
Yes, the practice of thinking in English.
This is the Holy Grail. Omar asks how one actually practices thinking in a foreign language. Layla suggests integrating it into the most mundane tasks imaginable.
Right.
As you go about your day, describe your actions to yourself using an internal English monologue. I am making tea now. I am walking down the stairs. I am opening the door. Why is narrating such an incredibly boring daily routine so powerful?
Because it aggressively attacks the single most destructive habit a language learner possesses: the compulsion to translate from their mother tongue.
Translation.
Translating in your head is like trying to render a 4K video while running a dozen other background apps on a computer. It takes up 90% of your cognitive CPU.
That's a great analogy.
If someone asks you a question in English and you catch the audio, translate it into your native language to understand it, formulate your response in your native language, and then translate that response back into English before speaking, the conversation has already moved on.
You're just miles behind.
You will be permanently lagging behind the real-time exchange.
So bypassing your native language frees up your mental RAM. By forcing your internal monologue to operate in simple English phrases, even if it's just, I am making tea, you are training the neural pathways to generate thoughts directly in the target language.
But exactly.
You are severing the translation middleman. Over time, that internal voice becomes faster, more complex, and eventually automatic.
So we have constructed the immersion bubble. The sticky notes are up, the subtitles are in English, we are narrating our tea-making process.
Right.
But how do we efficiently capture, store, and recall the sheer volume of specific vocabulary words we are encountering? The English dictionary is an endless ocean, and learners frequently drown in vocabulary lists.
Which is exhausting. But the source text provides a highly strategic filter to prevent that overwhelm. First, Lila establishes a psychological prerequisite: acquiring vocabulary through reading must be driven by genuine interest, not academic obligation.
This is so important.
When Omar asks if he should read classic novels or the daily news, Lila redirects him to his personal passions. Omar loves technology and gadgets, so she instructs him to read tech blogs.
This leverages curiosity as a cognitive fuel. If you are reading a dense article in a foreign language about a topic you don't care about, the friction of the language will cause you to quit.
Yeah.
But if you are deeply fascinated by the subject matter, say, the specs of a new smartphone, your desire to know the information will pull you through the linguistic difficulty.
Interest sustains attention, and attention is the gateway to memory.
Exactly.
But the text doesn't stop at just reading what you love. It introduces a mathematically precise approach to selecting which words to actually memorize. Omar excitedly brings up the Pareto principle.
The 80-20 rule.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Pareto principle suggests that 20% of your efforts yield 80% of your results. Applied to linguistics, Layla confirms that a tiny fraction of the vocabulary makes up the vast majority of daily communication.
It's true.
She points out that mastering the 1,000 most common English words will allow you to understand and participate in nearly 80% of everyday conversations.
In linguistics, this reflects Zipf's law, which demonstrates how certain core structural and descriptive words are used with exponential frequency compared to the rest of the dictionary.
Right.
Why spend agonizing hours memorizing the word serendipitous when you haven't yet mastered the multiple ways native speakers use the word get or take?
Exactly.
Layla calls focusing on these high-frequency words a smart shortcut for efficiency.
Okay, so we isolate those high-yield targets. But the mechanics of how we learn them is where traditional schooling sails us. The text explicitly warns against staring at isolated lists of words with their definitions translated next to them.
That never works.
Instead, Lila introduces the critical concept of collocations.
A collocation is a habitual pairing of words. It is how words naturally behave together in the wild. Words do not exist in a vacuum. They form networks.
Omar provides a perfect, simple example of this from the text. He notes the difference between fast food and quick food.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. Technically, grammatically, logically, quick and fast are synonyms. Quick food is a perfectly constructed phrase. But if you walk into a restaurant and ask for quick food, a native speaker's brain will experience a tiny neurological hiccup. It sounds utterly unnatural.
Because the word fast has a strong semantic bond with food in the English language. Quick bonds with glance or shower or decision.
Right.
When you learn vocabulary through collocations, learning chunks of language rather than isolated fragments, you absorb the natural rhythm and associative logic of the native speaker. You stop sounding like a walking thesaurus and start sounding like a local.
And to retain these collocations, the text highlights the necessity of structured review. Layla suggests organizing vocabulary, thematically grouping kitchen words together rather than relying on alphabetical lists.
That makes much more sense.
But more importantly, the text touches on the technology of digital flashcards utilizing spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition software, or SRS, is perhaps the most powerful application of cognitive science in language learning.
How does it work?
It is built entirely around the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. In the late 19th century, Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered that memories decay at a predictable mathematical rate. An SRS algorithm tracks that decay curve for every individual word you learn.
Okay.
It calculates the exact moment your brain is on the verge of forgetting a word, and it forces you to recall it right then.
And the struggle to recall the word at the very edge of forgetting is what forces the brain to thicken the myelin sheath around that specific neural pathway. It tells the brain, do not delete this file. It is crucial for survival.
Exactly.
It is infinitely more efficient than cramming a list for 2 hours.
Aside from algorithms, the text highlights a much older, deeply human mechanism for cementing memory, which is emotions, specifically humor.
Oh, this part is great.
Yeah, in the dialogue, Omar asks Lila if she has ever made a funny mistake during her own language journey. Layla shares a highly relatable story about accidentally asking a waiter in a restaurant for a snake instead of a snack.
I can vividly imagine the absolute confusion and horror on the waiter's face.
Oh, for sure.
But Omar astutely points out why this terrifying, embarrassing moment is actually a neurological gift. If a vocabulary word is tied to a spike in emotion, whether it is intense embarrassment, shock, or raucous laughter, you will never, ever forget it.
The neuroscience backs this up perfectly. Emotional responses are mediated by the amygdala. When you make a hilarious or mortifying mistake, The amygdala fires, essentially placing a chemical tag on the event.
Right.
It signals the hippocampus, this moment is highly significant. Burn it into long-term storage immediately so we don't ask for a reptile in a restaurant ever again.
Yeah.
Emotion is the ultimate memory enhancer.
Mistakes, misunderstandings, and embarrassment are not just inevitable. They are the biochemical catalysts for permanent retention.
They really are.
So we are accumulating this massive database of high-frequency vocabulary, collocations, and emotionally tagged mistakes. The next challenge is taking all of that raw material and structuring it into coherent, complex thoughts. This brings us to the most controversial topic in language acquisition, the absolute elephant in the room.
Grammar.
Yes, grammar. The source text takes a highly aggressive, almost rebellious stance against traditional grammar instruction.
It does.
Layla tells Omar point blank, grammar is important, but don't get stuck in it. She constantly reminds him that language is a tool for human connection, not an academic test to be passed.
Right.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. If we deliberately deprioritize the rules of syntax, won't we just generate chaotic, incomprehensible word salads? If I don't know the rules of tense, how can anyone understand when an event occurred?
Well, the text is not advocating for the total abandonment of grammar. It is arguing for a radical shift in the hierarchy of importance. The danger of traditional education is that it treats declarative memory, knowing the rules, as superior to procedural memory, the actual ability to perform the skill.
Okay.
Layla warns that fixating on grammatical perfection induces analysis paralysis.
Omar uses that exact phrase later in the dialogue, analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
You're in the middle of a sentence, trying to tell a story at a dinner party, and instead of focusing on the punchline, your brain completely freezes because you are running a frantic internal checklist on whether he's the present perfect continuous or the past perfect.
Exactly. And by the time you solve the grammatical equation, the moment has passed, the listener has tuned out, and the connection is dead.
Focusing entirely on the how destroys the ability to do. The text proposes a flipped model. Treat grammar textbooks purely as diagnostic reference manuals, not as residence halls. You do not live inside the textbook.
That's a perfect way to put it.
You go out into the world, you attempt to communicate using your raw vocabulary, and when you inevitably hit a structural wall, for instance, Omar gets confused about when to use since versus for, then you consult the grammar book.
Right.
You look up the specific solution to your specific problem, you apply it, and you immediately close the book and return to the real world. Grammar becomes a tool to fix a communication breakdown, rather than a prerequisite you must master before you are granted permission to speak.
This pragmatic philosophy perfectly aligns with the text's distinction between formal textbook English and the messy reality of street-level English. Layla points out that native speakers constantly violate grammatical rules.
All the time.
They use contractions constantly. You rarely hear the stiff, formal, I am going to. You hear the blurred, efficient, I'm gonna.
Right. If you only ever train your ear on the sterile, perfectly enunciated audio tracks provided by a textbook publisher, you will suffer massive auditory shock when you step off a plane in Chicago, Sydney, or London.
Oh, absolutely.
The text insists that absorbing slang, idioms, and connected speech is not optional. It is mandatory for real-world comprehension.
However, Layla does provide a crucial caveat regarding context and tone. While you must understand casual street English, you must also possess the social intelligence to know when not to use it.
The spectrum of register.
Yes, exactly. Dropping a casual "hey there" into a formal business email instead of "dear sir" or "madam" can have disastrous professional consequences. Fluency is knowing which version of the language to deploy in which environment.
And to practice structuring these different registers without the terrifying pressure of a live audience staring at you, the text highly recommends developing a daily writing habit.
Writing is huge.
Layla advises Omar to keep a private journal in English. She stresses that he should start with painfully simple declarative sentences. Today I went to the park, I drank coffee, I read a book.
Writing is the perfect sandbox for output because it removes the variable of time. When you speak, silence feels like failure. But when you write, you have the luxury of sitting for 3 minutes to search your memory for the exact right collocation, or to double-check the syntax without a conversation partner waiting impatiently. It bridges the gap between thought and expression in a low-stakes environment.
But writing in English introduces its own unique nightmare, which Omar quickly points out. English spelling is historically chaotic and deeply illogical.
It's a mess.
He lists words like though, through, and thought. They share nearly identical letter combinations, yet they are pronounced entirely differently. It feels like a prank played on the learner.
It violates every rule of phonetic logic.
Seriously, how does the text suggest a learner navigate this madness?
Layla offers 2 specific strategies. The first is extensive, voluminous reading. You have to expose your brain to the visual shape of the words so frequently that the spelling becomes a visual pattern recognized by the brain rather than a phonetic sequence to be sounded out.
Okay.
The second strategy is the classic, somewhat old-fashioned exercise of dictation.
Dictation. Listening to an audio sentence and forcing yourself to write it out perfectly word for word.
Exactly. It forces your brain to confront the specific gap between the chaotic spelling and the actual sound.
And when Omar voices his sheer frustration over silent letters like the K in no or the W in right, asking why they even exist, Lila diffuses the tension with a wonderful piece of imagery.
I love this part.
She calls silent letters ghost letters that are just there for decoration.
It's brilliant.
I found that framing so incredibly helpful. Instead of raging against the historical linguistic mess of the English language, you just accept it. You stop demanding logic where there is none, and you just accept the K as a quirky historical hood ornament on the word.
Yeah.
It preserves the learner's sanity.
So let us assume the learner has implemented all of this. They are practicing dictation for the ghost letters, they are shadowing native speakers, they are consuming comprehensible input, and they are using grammar as a diagnostic tool.
Right, they're doing everything right.
They achieve a level of intermediate competence. They can survive a restaurant interaction, they can send an email. But this is exactly where the most dangerous psychological phase of the journey begins.
They plateau.
Yes. Omar admits it openly in the dialogue. He says, "Some days I feel like I am not improving at all."
The notorious intermediate plateau. It is the graveyard of language learners.
It really is.
When you first start, going from 0 words to 50 words feels like explosive, euphoric growth. But going from 2,000 words to 2,050 words feels entirely invisible. How does Lila advise breaking out of this stagnant phase to reach advanced fluency?
The text delivers some necessary tough love here. To shatter the plateau, Layla tells Omar he must systematically strip away the safety nets. He has to stop watching perfectly articulated, slow-paced English for Beginners videos.
Wow, cut the cord.
Yeah. When you hit a plateau, it is a biological signal that your brain has successfully adapted to the current level of stress. Because the brain conserves energy, it will stop growing new neural connections if the environment doesn't demand it.
So, to trigger neuroplasticity again, you have to induce struggle. Lila advises pushing into academic or highly specialized vocabulary.
Exactly.
If Omar loves reading about technology, he should force himself to watch a dense documentary about marine biology or macroeconomics. He needs to plunge himself back into an environment where he only understands 60% of the vocabulary, forcing the brain to panic slightly and resume the adaptation process.
Growth exclusively happens at the edge of your comfort zone. But breaking the plateau isn't just about acquiring larger, more obscure words. Advanced fluency requires mastering the invisible physical mechanics of the language.
The music of English.
Yes. Layla dives deeply into what she calls the music of English. She explains a fundamental linguistic concept: English is a stress-timed language.
This concept completely changed how I listen to spoken English. What is the mechanism behind stress timing, and how does it differ from other languages?
Well, in a syllable-timed language like Spanish or Japanese, every single syllable generally receives an equal amount of time and emphasis. The rhythm is steady and machine gun-like da-da-da-da-da. Okay. English, however, operates on a completely different metric. The rhythm of an English sentence is dictated entirely by the stress placed on the important words, while the unimportant words are violently compressed and swallowed.
The text categorizes these as content words versus function words.
Right.
Content words are your heavy lifters, the nouns, the main verbs, the adjectives, the words that carry the actual meaning of the sentence. Function words are the grammatical glue articles like the or a, prepositions like to or for.
So in spoken English, you hit the content words with maximum volume and duration, and you fast forward through the function words as quickly as physically possible.
Like the example.
Yes, I want to go to the store becomes I want to go to the store. This uneven compression creates a rolling, alternating beat.
Right.
If a learner tries to pronounce every single word in an English sentence with equal weight and perfect clarity, they will sound incredibly robotic, no matter how vast their vocabulary is. Advanced fluency is surrendering to that uneven beat.
And deeply intertwined with that beat is the nuance of intonation, the rising and falling pitch of the voice. Pitch in English does not change the dictionary definition of a word, but it radically alters the psychological intent behind it.
Oh, definitely.
Omar highlights a brilliant example from the text using a single word, really.
It is a perfect case study.
Yeah.
If you say really with a high, sharply rising pitch at the end, it indicates genuine surprise or request for confirmation.
Right.
If you say really with a flat descending pitch, it communicates profound sarcasm, disbelief, or annoyance.
The exact same letters, the exact same sequence of vowels and consonants, but completely opposite meanings,
Right.
dictated entirely by the musical frequency of the vocal cords.
Yes.
Mastering that pitch variation is the hallmark of an advanced speaker.
Mm-hmm.
But ironically, when learners try to sound advanced, they usually make a massive mechanical error. Omar brings this up. Learners often try to speak incredibly fast, equating speed with native-level fluency.
It is a false equivalence driven by anxiety. We assume that if we speak rapidly, the listener won't have time to notice our grammatical errors.
That makes a lot of sense.
But Lila firmly dismantles this strategy. She urges Omar to focus on clarity and deliberate pacing. Even highly educated native speakers slow down when they want to convey authority or complex ideas. Speed does not equal intelligence. It often just equals panic.
Lila specifically champions the strategic use of pauses. For a learner, silence feels like a terrifying void where the listener is judging them. But Lila reframes the pause as a powerful tool.
Pausing is crucial.
Taking a deliberate breath gives your brain the necessary milliseconds to retrieve the next collocation. And more importantly, it gives the listener time to digest your previous thought. Someone who pauses thoughtfully commands much more respect than someone rushing and stumbling over their own tongue.
Pausing projects status and control. But inevitably, no matter how carefully you pace yourself, you will experience the dreaded mental blank.
The worst feeling.
You will completely forget a crucial noun in the middle of a sentence. Lila introduces an advanced cognitive tool to handle this gracefully, a term that highly impresses Omar: circumlocution.
Circumlocution. The art of talking around the missing piece. Lila explains that if you are in a kitchen and you completely forget the word refrigerator, you do not freeze, panic, and apologize.
Right, you don't stop.
You seamlessly pivot and describe the object using the vocabulary you do possess. You say, the tall, cold box in the kitchen where we keep the milk.
This is why her earlier advice about using an English dictionary is so vital. When you read English definitions, you are subconsciously training your brain in the art of circumlocution.
Ah, I didn't think of that.
You are learning the structural formulas for defining concepts. A beginner lets a missing word derail the entire conversation. An advanced speaker uses circumlocution to pave over the pothole without the listener ever realizing a word was forgotten.
You just described the shape of the hole it left behind. And to weave all of these descriptions, thoughts, and pauses together into a cohesive argument, the text offers one final mechanical upgrade linking words.
Conjunctions and transitional adverbs. Words like however, therefore, furthermore, and consequently.
Layla describes them as the glue that binds isolated sentences into sophisticated paragraphs. Omar notes that injecting just a few of these linking words immediately elevates his speech from sounding like a disjointed list of toddler statements to a structured intellectual argument.
Linking words act as cognitive signposts for the listener. When you say, however, you are pre-signaling to the listener's brain that a contrasting idea is about to arrive. You are guiding their processing. It demonstrates high-level mastery of the flow of information.
Mastering circumlocution, stress time rhythm, and transitional glue requires an astonishing amount of cognitive effort. And maintaining that effort day after day, month after month, brings us to the final and undoubtedly most critical section of our deep dive.
The psychology.
The underlying psychology of endurance. Mechanics are completely useless if the learner quits on day 14. How do you sustain the motivation required to cross the desert of language acquisition?
The source text isolates motivation as the primary engine of success. Before Layla offers any more mechanical tips, she forces Omar to articulate his core motivation. She asks him point blank, why do you want to learn English?
Omar's answer is highly personal and vivid. He says he wants to travel the world. He conjures a specific mental image of walking the neon-lit streets of Tokyo and using English as the bridge to communicate with a local shop owner. That image is his why.
And as Layla explicitly states, if the why is emotionally resonant and powerful enough, the how becomes manageable.
Right.
If your motivation is simply, I think it would be neat to put it on my resume, you will inevitably quit the moment the grammar becomes difficult. If your motivation is a burning desire to connect with a specific culture or to transform your family's economic future, that engine will pull you through the intermediate plateau.
But even with a roaring engine, learners inevitably hit the most common obstacle, the universal excuse that Lila hears constantly. Omar brings it up, the perceived lack of time. I simply don't have time to sit down and study.
Layla is entirely unsympathetic to this excuse.
Very blunt.
She delivers a blunt truth. Every single human being has the exact same 24 hours in a day. The issue is never a lack of time. It is a lack of prioritization and efficiency.
Her solution is aggressive multitasking. You have to reclaim the dead time hidden in your daily routine. You listen to English audio while driving to work, while folding laundry, while doing the dishes.
Yes, exactly.
You stack the auditory input on top of automated, mindless physical tasks. You transform your commute into a mobile language laboratory.
This approach emphasizes efficiency, but it also perfectly aligns with the text's most crucial principle regarding the neurobiology of habit formation. Layla establishes an unbreakable golden rule for Omar. Consistency is infinitely more important than intensity.
So what does this all mean? Omar processes this and concludes 20 minutes daily is better than 2 hours once a week. Let's look at the mechanism there. Why does the brain prefer the 20-minute daily drip over the 2-hour weekend binge?
It comes down to synaptic pruning. If you force yourself to study intensely for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon, your brain forms new synaptic connections. But if you then ignore the language completely from Monday to Saturday, the brain assumes those new connections are useless, low-priority data.
Oh, okay.
To conserve energy, it physically prunes those pathways. By Wednesday, the vocabulary is gone.
That's heartbreaking.
Right. But if you interact with the language for just 20 minutes every single day, you are constantly sending an electrical signal through that pathway, signaling to the brain, this is vital for daily survival, reinforce this circuit.
The very structure of the text title proves the mathematical power of this consistency. It's a 500-sentence guide. Lila breaks down the math for Omar. If he commits to learning, understanding, and shadowing just 5 practical sentences a day, a task that takes perhaps 20 minutes, he will reach the 500-sentence milestone in precisely 100 days.
100 days. That is just over 3 months. By breaking the insurmountable abstract mountain of fluency down into microscopic daily quotas, she eliminates the overwhelm.
But to practice those 5 sentences daily in the modern era, Omar brings up a tool that is revolutionizing the landscape: artificial intelligence. He suggests using AI platforms as a personal conversation tutor.
From a purely practical standpoint, it is a brilliant strategy. An AI tutor is the ultimate patient entity.
True.
It does not fatigue, it is available at 3 a.m., and crucially, it eliminates the social anxiety of making mistakes. It will correct your syntax instantly without a hint of judgment or impatience.
It sounds like the perfect frictionless solution. But Lila immediately pushes back, raising a profound philosophical question. Can an algorithm fully replace the friction of human interaction in the pursuit of language?
This raises an important question, and the text argues a definitive no. AI is an exceptional tool for rehearsal and structural correction, but it cannot replicate the biological stakes of human connection.
Right.
Language evolved for the express purpose of building social bonds, navigating hierarchies, and sharing empathy. Overcoming the vulnerability and fear of speaking to a real, unpredictable human being is an irreplaceable part of the psychological journey.
Lila reminds Omar, and by extension you, the listener, that the paralyzing fear of judgment is largely a projection. The vast majority of native speakers are not waiting to mock your grammar.
Exactly.
When they see a foreigner genuinely struggling to use their language to bridge a cultural gap, the default human response is usually empathy and a desire to help. Kindness is the actual universal language, and English is merely the current global tool used to transmit it.
You cannot experience that shared empathy, that rush of genuine human connection with a large language model. The friction and the vulnerability are the point.
And as you continuously expose yourself to that friction, building bridges across cultures, something deeply mysterious happens to your own internal architecture. As they near the end of their 500-sentence journey, Omar makes an observation that completely stopped me in my tracks.
What did he say?
He tells Lila, I feel like a different person when I speak English.
Layla immediately validates this, noting that it is a documented psychological phenomenon. Many bilingual individuals report developing a second personality that activates depending on which language they are speaking.
How is that neurologically possible? How does learning new vocabulary literally alter your personality?
Because a language is far more than a system of labeling objects. A language is a complex framework for interpreting reality. The grammar and idioms of a language carry the historical assumptions, the humor, and the values of the culture that created it. English, for example, is highly direct and heavily reliant on specific idioms that emphasize individualism and action.
Right, that makes sense.
When you operate within the English framework, you inevitably adopt a sliver of that cultural psychology. You might find that you are more assertive in English, or perhaps more humorous or more emotionally expressive than you are in your native tongue. You are literally viewing the world through a different cognitive lens.
It is the ultimate form of self-expansion. You are not just memorizing data, you are installing a secondary operating system for your consciousness.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the culmination of Omar and Lila's dialogue and the conclusion of our analysis today. To synthesize the holistic blueprint we have extracted from this text language acquisition requires feeding the auditory cortex with daily listening, even when it sounds like noise.
Yes.
It requires the physical conditioning of shadowing to build motor cortex muscle memory.
It demands the creation of an immersion bubble to hijack the brain's visual processing, the discipline to sever the internal translation middleman, and the humility to embrace mistakes, and the cringe of your own recorded voice as the raw fuel for neuroplasticity.
I want to leave you with one final vital piece of psychological armor from Layla's concluding advice. When you are staring up at the sheer vertical cliff of fluency, and you feel utterly inadequate, do not compare your day 1 to someone else's year 10.
That's beautiful.
The only relevant metric of progress is whether you are slightly more capable than the person you were yesterday. Fluency is not an academic state of flawless grammatical perfection. It is simply the ability to express your thoughts with smooth, unapologetic confidence.
The goal is connection, not perfection. As Layla suggests, if you focus on enjoying the mechanics of the daily walk, the mountain peak will eventually take care of itself.
Which brings us back to where we started. The landscape of learning a new language is chaotic, emotionally taxing, and deeply messy. But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder as you go about the rest of your day.
Okay.
If mastering these mechanics, the stress-timed rhythm, the collocations, the circumlocution, literally wires a second personality into your brain, granting you a completely new lens through which to view humanity, who was the person waiting for you at the end of this journey.
Wow.
And when you finally meet them, what parts of your current comfortable identity might you happily allow to remain lost in translation?
That is the true reward of the struggle.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of fluency. Until next time, keep exploring and keep speaking.